So welcome everyone today. Really glad that you're here with us. This is our COVID-19 economic impact discussion. I'm Phil Terry, of course, and with me is our special guest, Whitney Tilson. I'm going to introduce Whitney in a moment, but some of you still remember Whitney's talk in 2007 at the councils at the Harvard Club in New York when Whitney talked about the coming mortgage crisis, and obviously that was quite a prescient call. He also called the dotcom downturn, and today he has a different perspective. He's not. He doesn't think we're moving into what was the another version of the financial crisis. So, which is I think really helpful to hear about. So I'm gonna share some comments initially just to set the context, and then I'll introduce Whitney again and have him share some of his thinking, and then we'll do some Q&A and conversation. And let me see, it looks like there may be already one question in the Q&A. Yes, we are recording this session. Whitney, you okay with, I meant to ask you that.
Yeah, I'm totally fine. In fact, I was going to ask you whether it's something, I could share as well.
Yes, definitely you can. All right, cool. So, so let's get started. So first of all, I just want to point out to everybody, I don't know if this is showing up. Here we go. We have a single page on COVID-19, including the latest thinking on whether we're meeting in person at the end of April or not, and links to other resources. We're doing these flash talks, obviously today with Whitney Tilson, Friday on best practices and a remote workforce with the former chief product officer at Envision, which is a completely remote company with 900 employees. And we're doing flash roundtables. We have a survey that's going out. And we'd love to hear from you. Would you like us to set up a COVID-19 Slack channel just to be able to have an ongoing dialogue? If so, we can set that up, and I'll follow up about that later. All right, so, what? Sorry about that. Let me just, this context first. Part of the fear that's driving the markets today is this notion of China is prologue. So with the coronavirus in China in late January and especially February, they saw a huge crash in traffic because people were quarantined, congestion, pollution, like indicating factories were idled. The number of cinema goers plunged. The Lunar New Year is typically a time for massive ticket sales for movies. And as you can see in the chart, blue is 2019 and light blue or turquoise is 2020. A big collapse there. Vehicle sales in January collapsed 21% and in February 92%. A whole bunch of cargo ships, about 50% of the typical traffic idled. 2 million containers of seaborne shipping idled. 50% of their truck drivers idled in February. Their manufacturing gauge in February was worse than 2008. 80% drop in Chinese air travel passenger volumes, 92% drop in new car sales. The rest of the world, there's reports out that maybe there'll be a massive hit to the global travel industry. 2,000 aircraft are grounded, 25% drop in US April bookings. Like last week, the number of bookings for travel in April in the United States by a plane dropped by 25%, 80% drop in bookings to Europe. Of course, everyone knows the South by Southwest conference was canceled last week. 440 conferences are canceled. Non-essential global travel bans. Amazon now and many other companies, most of your companies have said all non-essential travel, not just to APAC or Italy, but everywhere, including domestic US, has been canceled. And the stock market obviously has crashed. Airline bookings are down, as I said. Traffic growth by region is really down. So there's this sense, today's a little bit better in the market, but yesterday there was a massive fear reaction, like, oh my God, what happened to China is going to happen here. And Whitney actually put out a report yesterday that said, wait a minute, I think we have some things wrong. So now let me introduce Whitney Tilson. So as I mentioned, Whitney gave a talk in 2007 to the councils on the coming mortgage crisis and then authored a book called The Mortgage Meltdown, and then a follow-up book called More Mortgage Meltdown. He's been featured on 60 Minutes twice, Whitney, I think, right?
Yep.
A lot of CNBC, a lot of other media. He's got a great, and he and I have been friends for like 20 years. He now runs in Empire Investment Research, and a lot of people are, follow him and his team of analysts who, look at what's going on in the market and think from the investor point of view. Whitney also is the person who got me connected to Buffett and Munger. He was a co-editor or associate editor of Poor Charlie's Almanac, the terrific book about Charlie Munger. And Whitney helped us get started our Berkshire Hathaway events 5 years ago, which hopefully we'll still be doing this year. So there's a lot more to say about Whitney, but he put out this prescient analysis. So I just asked him yesterday after he published that, hey, would you be willing to come talk to the councils? Because there's a fair amount of fear and concern and think, a lot of questions about, hey, what's coming? Is this a 1 or 2 quarter impact? Is there a major recession? And of course, nobody has a crystal ball, but Whitney's looked at some important data. So Whitney, let me turn it over to you now. I'll go ahead and control the slides. But why don't we walk through your analysis?
Sure. Let me just before we dive into the analysis. First of all, thank you for having me, Phil. I've been sort of obsessed with the whole coronavirus and its implications. I used to run a hedge fund. I now publish an investment newsletter. So it's obviously this is something that is shaking the markets around the world. And my job is to try and give my subscribers the best advice possible from an investment perspective. But really, in order to have a sensible investment perspective, like, should you be standing on the sidelines? Are things going to get a lot worse? Or is it time to start buying beaten down stocks because this too shall pass? Requires you to have at least do some research and have some sort of opinion on, is this the next coming of the 1918, pandemic that killed 30 to 50 million people around the world? Or will this be another, Ebola, swine flu, bird flu, MERS, SARS, et cetera, like previous health scares, which, humanity got a handle on. I tend to think the latter. I'll walk you through some of the analysis, but I'll be humble up front in that I could be completely wrong. Maybe we all should be right to be panicking and quarantining, doing large-scale quarantines and so forth. I don't think so now, but I'm following the information, and the data all around the world closely. I actually think the fewer people are concerned about us becoming the next China, which has been the epicenter of this crisis, but rather us becoming the next Italy, a much more developed country that it happened later. And if we start to develop the way Italy has developed, the stock market's got a lot further to fall, and there's going to be much more onerous outcomes here. So I'll also acknowledge up front, I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm not a doctor, I don't have access to any proprietary information, but I've been around a long time. I've seen a lot of investor panics, I've seen a lot of health scare panics, and I've done a lot of research on it. So I decided to put my thoughts out there. First on Monday and then again today to the 35,000 or so people who subscribe to my free daily investing newsletter. And any of you who want to join it, just go to empirefinancialresearch.com, and there's a little box in the upper right corner. Just pop in your email address and you can access, you'll get an email every day, or middle of the day roughly, every weekday with my latest thoughts, mostly investment related, but they've been very heavily coronavirus related in the past week or so. And you can also access the archive if you want to read, what I had to say yesterday and today. And I will, Phil, you can feel free to share, Phil, the 12-page detailed report that I did, some of the charts from that. That was only for my paid subscribers, but I'm happy to share it with your group as well, Phil. So feel free to send that around. It's just a 12-page PDF. Yeah. So with that, Phil, with that, why don't we just skip to at least some of the data out there, and then happy to open it up for Q&A.
And again, as Whitney's talking, if you have a question, go ahead and post it in the Q&A, and we may be able to answer it then, or at least certainly by the Q&A round. And I'll just say one more thing, which is, both Whitney and I are proteges, if you will, or students of Buffett and Munger. And one of the things that Buffett talks a lot about is if you want to be a good business manager, you need to understand the investor perspective. And if you want to be a good investor, you need to understand the manager perspective. And I think one of the things Whitney does well is combine both of those. And of course, most of you on the call are coming today with a manager perspective, but I think you'll be interested to know the investor perspective and the underlying data that I think both that can inform you whatever the stock market does or doesn't do. Yeah. Okay. All right. So Whitney, do you want me to start with
Sure.
sort of
Well,
first slide?
let me just start out, skip to the next slide. I'm not seeing it, Phil. There we go. Okay. This is a slide from the Centers for Disease Control. Notice the data is 2 years old. So this just goes through 2018. But there are many scientific similarities between the coronavirus and the seasonal flu, seasonal influenza. You know, it's important to put the numbers into perspective here. Let me pull up the latest data, but this shows that the seasonal flu ebbs and flows every year. That's what the up and down of these charts. It's obviously very seasonal. Virtually all the illnesses and deaths occur from September to March. One very big piece of good news around hopefully the coronavirus, but definitely seasonal influenza, is warm weather tends to kill it. And so that's what Trump was talking about when he says, you know, I heard, you know, come April, this is all going to go away. Maybe in the Northern Hemisphere that may actually help reduce the incidence. It's not clear though. There's so much uncertainty around this particular COVID-19 variant. But to give perspective, every year in the United States, over the past 10 years, between 12,000 and 61,000 deaths are attributed to just the seasonal flu. And that accounts over the course of a year, roughly 2% of all deaths in America. And in fact, this season is about average. There have been 32 million Americans just since September who've gotten seasonal influenza, the flu. 310,000 of them have required hospitalizations. And as of the end of February, 18,000 Americans have died since September because of the plain old seasonal flu that happens every year. And by the way, last month, we're still in flu season, last month that accounted for 6.9% of all deaths in America, including just people dying of old age. So as a nation, we have chosen to accept between 12 and 61,000 deaths every year due to the flu. Now, as a nation, we could reduce those numbers. I was just talking to my cousin who's a doctor the other day. And I said, geez, that sounds like a high number. Why haven't we been dealing with this for years? And she's like, you know, hospitals and doctors do deal with it. We take precautions during flu season. There is a vaccine that's 45% effective. We encourage people to get it. But, you know, the reality is by and large, Americans, by and large, ignore the seasonal flu. Regulators ignore it. Politicians ignore it. And as a nation, we accept 12 to 61,000 deaths every year. Now, we could reduce that number dramatically. We could stop traveling. We could stop going to concerts. We could shut down schools and universities. We could do the things we are doing right now with the coronavirus, and we could reduce that. We as a nation have, I think, quite correctly chosen not to shut down every year, shut down our economy and shut down our universities and stop traveling between September and March, because the cost of the reaction to try and reduce those flu deaths far exceeds, you know, the cost is way too high as a nation. And you have to put, you know, 12 to 61,000 is a high number. On the other hand, we're a nation of 310 million people. And by the way, the vast majority of seasonal flu deaths occur among the elderly, people who are ill and or who have compromised immune systems, et cetera, which happens to be exactly the case with the coronavirus. That said, I am not saying that the coronavirus is going to be a great big nothing burger that we shouldn't react to at all, like the seasonal flu. It is clearly more contagious. How much more contagious, nobody knows. It clearly has a higher mortality rate. How much higher, nobody knows. Will it just fade out once the warm weather comes in the Northern Hemisphere, where the 12 countries with the greatest number of coronavirus cases right now are all in the Northern Hemisphere. The 13th is Australia, which has, you know, 100 cases or so. Those 12 countries account for 97% of all reported corona cases worldwide. So again, we can cross our fingers and hope to get lucky that as warm weather returns to the Northern Hemisphere, this fades away sort of on its own because of warm weather. But again, we don't know for sure whether that will happen, whether the coronavirus will prove to be like like the flu, for example. So, by the way, I gave you the US number of 12 to 61,000 flu deaths every year. Worldwide, that number is 290,000 to 650,000 people die per year worldwide of the seasonal flu, according to the WHO. Let's, and in the United States.
2 quick questions.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Phil.
A couple of quick questions and also a comment. Japan has this year reduced seasonal deaths of the flu because they started a much more rigorous public health campaign around hand washing, right? So that's like one of the things we could do to actually, short of shutting things down, is literally wash our hands better. It turns out fewer people would die. There are a couple of comments here.
Yep.
Eric Nadler says, since we haven't been testing for COVID-19, could some of the flu deaths this year be coronavirus?
Yes. And by the way, the numbers in the US and across most of the developed world are probably still significantly understated, because most people, apparently, something like 85% of people who have been tested and confirmed to have the coronavirus have relatively mild symptoms, not much worse than your common cold, and they recover. And so it is very highly concentrated among people 65 or older, particularly people age 80 and older, and people who are lifetime smokers and who have other factors. That's true of the coronavirus and of the seasonal flu.
Yeah. All right, a couple more questions. How do you account for the outbreak in Iran? It's quite warm there. Question mark. And is it actually quite warm there now?
I don't know actually. It's Iran is clearly in the Northern Hemisphere, and it's certainly winter for them. But Iran's a little bit of a weird one. I think they don't have a very well-functioning government or a very high-quality health system, and certainly they didn't react quickly initially. I think the government initially was trying to hide it, which is, by the way, initially why things got so bad in China. They first didn't know what they had on their hands. Then there was at least a month-long campaign of trying to silence anyone who was blowing the whistle. The good news, though, is that once they finally did take it seriously, there are virtually no new cases occurring across all of China. Yesterday, it was 40 new cases in a country of 1.4 billion people. Today, the number hit another all-time low, only 26 new cases. So. That's one. And now they did it with very, very onerous, basically locking down 60 million people. The good news, though, is that it did work. And now countries are scrambling. There's not going to be 2 months of denial, which is what really led things to explode in China.
Yeah. One more question. Okay. So Kristen Johansson is saying some of the recent health scares like MERS and Ebola were naturally limited by the fact that they were consistently symptomatic and highly fatal.
Yes.
This virus seems to have a much lower impact on many of the people it infects, resulting in mostly younger carriers who are asymptomatic or at least not very effective.
Yeah, skip to the next slide, Phil. I think that's the slide. Is that the slide we have? I forget what order you have them in, but so here's some of the headlines. Just skip past this.
Okay.
Okay, this gets to, this was something I found in the New York Times, and on the right-hand axis is the R0 metric of how many people the average person infects, and the x-axis going upward is the mortality rate on a log scale. So just look at the bird flu in the upper left. It didn't transmit much at all, but more than 50% of the people who got it died. Ebola, you can see the average person infected a little more than one other person was also highly deadly, 50%, right? So you see MERS, SARS, Ebola clustered up there. And then you look down at the bottom, for example, you have the seasonal flu is 0.1% mortality rate in the US, and the average person infects about one other person. So, it infects a lot of people, but it has a fairly low mortality rate. The coronavirus is that big red box, and what's freaking people out is that big red box in the upper right corner is 10 million deaths worldwide, roughly speaking. And in the lower left corner is it's sort of a gigantic nothing burger. And we don't know the answer. And so I guess, there is an argument, and the best argument I've heard is the reason we should be taking extreme measures is that if we can't rule out the upper right, let's take extreme measures. My view on that, though, is extreme measures have a big cost. In Italy, for example, I have absolutely no doubt that there are elderly people in Italy who, with the whole country locked down, will start feeling sick, not due to the coronavirus. They're just old and infirm, and they won't go to the hospital because all the roads are shut down, et cetera. They'll choose not to go. And by the way, their children or their friends won't be over visiting them, again, because all the roads are shut down. So there could be a significant health cost to large-scale lockdowns. And it obviously has an enormous economic cost, and that means businesses go bankrupt, people lose their jobs, people go bankrupt. So those are very serious, those are certain consequences to an overreaction. And so, I guess the question is I think most reasonable people are like, okay, we don't want to underreact. There's a lot of uncertainty here, but there are huge, but overreacting, what does overreacting look like? And, in my personal opinion, I just yesterday sent emails to the presidents of both Wake Forest and Carleton colleges, where one of my daughters is currently at Wake Forest. Carleton, my oldest daughter, graduated from a year and a half ago, and my youngest daughter is going there in the fall. So I know both of those university presidents well. And I said, I hope you resist the peer pressure from, Harvard just announced all in-person classes are closed till the end of the month. And not only that, but everyone has to completely clear out, empty their dorms, move out. That strikes me. I'm not aware that there is a single person, a single student at Harvard, and this is breaking news, so I haven't had a chance to really research it. But, it strikes me as the ultimate covering your ass move. When there's no reason to believe that a group of young people, by and large, young, healthy people who are going to these colleges, particularly a school like Carleton out there in the middle of the plains, 45 minutes south of Minneapolis, so they're not in an urban area. It just strikes me as an overreaction. As another example,
Hey, Whitney, hang on, there's a couple more comments in here, and I want to make sure we address one of these. So Doug Claffey is saying that Italy, as of 3 hours ago, has jumped to 650 deaths out of 10,000 confirmed cases, which gives it a mortality rate of 6.5%.
Yes.
Above the red box, obviously.
Yes.
So do you have a point? Do you look at any of the data there?
Everyone is trying to figure out why Italy has been particularly hard hit. I did hear from a friend in Italy that as the virus first started, and it was a couple months ago, Italy laughed it off. Someone wore, for example, a mask into Parliament, and everyone else in Parliament laughed at the guy, right? So it should not surprise anyone that the government of Italy was massively incompetent. They are known around the world. In contrast, Germany took it seriously from the beginning and didn't laugh it off, and they have had 2 deaths across all of Germany versus 650 or so in Italy. So the question is, and it's an open question. I cannot say with certainty, Italy could be the canary in the coal mine for all of Europe, and it may come across the ocean, in which case we are all in big trouble. I suspect, though, that Italy will prove to be the outlier, and that France, Spain, Germany, which have 33 deaths, 35 deaths, and 2 deaths, that the United States, as of the latest chart, and there are plenty of websites, you can track this literally to the minute. The United States currently has 28 deaths, I think 18 or 20 of which were from the one nursing home in Kirkland, Washington. which again provided the perfect conditions for incubation and spread among an elderly population, right? So the question is, in light of this uncertainty, what degree this should be absolutely taken seriously. Like, some people responded to my emails saying, Whitney, you're doing a grave disservice by laughing this off and telling people to ignore it. And I am absolutely not doing that. I'm just saying, don't lose your mind it's a classic human failing to overreact to vivid recent evidence. Nobody was shutting down the world when 12 to 61,000 people are dying of the flu every day. It was a risk we chose to live with, and I don't think we should overreact. And as another example, I just saw a headline: the American Nursing Home Association, or whatever it's called, just put out a notice saying nobody should visit anyone in a nursing home anywhere in the country, full stop. And that's just idiotic, in my opinion. I think every university in the country just shutting down indefinitely is idiotic.
All right, so let's keep going. And there are a couple of, I want to try to, politics are important, I get that, but I want to try to veer away. But one of our attendees asked a question about, like, given that the VP is in charge, how are we different than Italy? But let's pause that question.
Yes, it does not give many people comfort that our coronavirus czar does not believe in evolution. Forgive me if that's a political comment.
Okay. And so let's keep going. I'm losing my mouse when I play the PowerPoint, so I'm just going to do it like this.
Okay, no worries. So we might as well get through it. Phil, do you want to try and there are like two more slides just showing. Let's just show those two slides, and then we can open it up for. We don't have any more slides.
Can you see this right now? By the way, can you see the slide? The reported cases in China.
Yeah. So what you can see is it's a very steep looking curve, and then it's completely flattened out. So if you go to the next page, that's what's they changed the definition on February 13th, 14th, and 15th. So this X's that out. But basically, you can see what happened in China is the very sharp uptick, which is what you are seeing now from a very low base in countries like Italy and so forth. But keep in mind here, China peaked at 4,000 new cases a day. If you just go pull up the charts, in the last day, there were 26 new cases in China. So they've tapered off to almost nil. Just looking down the other infected countries, I'm on a website here, worldometers.info, world, a letter O, meters.info. But you can find it anywhere. Italy had 977 new cases, Iran 881, and then it drops off pretty sharply from there. France, Spain, Germany, 200 to 300 cases. South Korea, by the way, which like China was hit early, which took strong measures, had only 35 new cases. And their mortality rate, they've had 58 deaths and 7,500. So it's very interesting. Why is the Italian mortality rate almost 10 times South Korea's mortality rate? Not quite clear, other than South Korea really got on this early, did massive testing, and Italy, I don't think, reacted as well. By the way, I'll also point out 23% of Italians are over age 65 versus 16% in the United States, 10%, 11% in China, and I think Korea probably looks, I don't know what Korea's number is, but in other words, Italy also has an unusually old population. They all smoke over there. So those are a couple other things to consider. So Phil, do you just want to skip
by the way,
last
and this goes without saying, I should have said it at the beginning, obviously we're going through numbers, we're talking about statistics. Every death is a meaningful and important and sad event. But we're trying to look at as the aggregate, and I just want to acknowledge that. I know we both feel that way. So, Whitney, if you could talk to your perspective on the economic impact, what's going to happen, because the big thing that's going on right now for a lot of companies, as you can imagine, is how do they forecast the next quarter, the next 2 quarters? Are we moving into a recession? The price of oil, has dropped significantly, although I think it's up a little bit today. I don't know where it's at. What's your point of view on
Yeah.
kind of the economic impact and the
Yeah.
activity.
Well, my sense is my general view is I am putting money to work both personally, just buying the S&P 500 index. I happen to be sitting on quite a bit of cash since I closed my hedge fund a couple of years ago. So I've been looking for an opportunity to start putting money to work. And, I've taken 20% of my net worth, my long-term net worth, my investable assets. A week ago, I put in 10%, and yesterday I put in another 10%, trying to get sort of more exposure. I do so with a fatalistic view that I have absolutely no idea when the bottom will be. But it's a fool's errand to try and exactly time the bottom. So just generally speaking, if you look at very sharp stock market corrections in history, like more than 10% in less than a week or two, there are only a handful in history, and virtually every one, the S&P 500 has been up 90 days later, almost without exception. Now, so maybe this time is different. I'm betting not. But there's a wide range of potential outcomes here. And by the way, in my investment newsletter, certain stocks, I mean, the market was down prior to today's rally, it was down, I don't know, 16% or so. Any stock, any smaller cap stock, any company with much debt, any company exposed to travel, Live Nation, Ticketmaster, which has concerts, any of the airlines, lodging companies, those stocks are all down 30 to 50%. And so I think this, if I'm right that the humanity as a whole sort of gets a hold on coronavirus, that the number of cases, the number of new cases starts to look like this chart we're looking at right here in China, in Italy, United States, Germany, France. And by the way, I'm thinking it's at least a couple weeks out, just because they're starting to test more people. So it's not, you're going to see a big rise in the number of reported new cases, simply because the countries are doing more testing and finding people who were already infected, a month ago or so. They just weren't reported in the numbers. So the headlines may be bad for at least a couple more weeks, maybe a month or two. And so the question, though, is the stock market is forward looking. And once investors start to anticipate the peak, stocks will start to rally. So from an investment perspective, I recommended to my subscribers buying shares of a stock we recommended a couple months ago, Spirit Airlines, which everybody loves to hate, but it's trading at 4 times earnings. It's consistently profitable, has the highest profit margins in the airline industry. Stock is down 50% in 2 weeks. And if this coronavirus panic passes, I don't think it's going to immediately double back to where it was 2 weeks ago, but I'll take a 50% gain in a short period of time, but you're taking more risk, right? So look, the safest thing to do is buy the S&P 500 index or buy Berkshire Hathaway. There's no doubt in my mind Warren Buffett is buying back his shares in size right now. You can't go wrong buying alongside Warren Buffett. If you want to take a little more risk, Phil, when you send out the PDF, we have write-ups of 3 of our favorite beaten down coronavirus exposed stocks. Spirit Airlines is one of them. You can read our write-ups and get a free look at our paid subscriber product, and what we're telling our investors, our subscribers. But you should know that I think certainly the first quarter and into the second quarter, companies all right, left, and center are going to report bad earnings. But investors already anticipate that. So the real thing I think you have to rule out, where you do not want to put any money to work, is one of my friends just emailed me and said, Whitney, you're completely wrong. The number of deaths worldwide is going to go to 1 million. We're at 4,000 today. He thinks the number, and this is a very well-known, prominent billionaire hedge fund manager, friend of mine. He thinks the number is going to be 1 million people, and he's still uber bearish. I cannot rule out that possibility, and if he's right, stocks are going to go down a lot more. But I don't think he's right. I think he's overreacting.
And again, and thank you for that, Whitney. And I think there's a question here I'm going to get to in a moment, but
sure, let's open up to Q&A. There's only one more slide you didn't show there, Phil, which was just the mortality rates.
Yeah. I want to sort of focus your mind on, like, if you were a manager today of a company, right?
Yeah.
how would you be thinking about economic scenarios?
Yeah.
And
Well,
you
look,
know,
the
demand?
first thing you need to do is think about your own employees, and whether you should just close your office and try and it depends sort of on the type of company that you are, and can people work remotely, et cetera. And it also, I suppose, depends on, do you have a lot of elderly employees? I mean, if you're Walmart and you've got a lot of 65 and 70-year-olds who are greeters in the front of the store coming into contact, maybe you want to get rid of the greeters for a little while, because those people are particularly vulnerable. Look, my daughter works at Ernst & Young out of Times Square. She's at a client at a big company, out in New Jersey, and she's going to work as usual. And so if you're that kind of professional firm, unless you have any reason to believe someone has coronavirus within your firm and could be infecting people, then, just washing hands. If you have any symptoms at all, stay home. Don't jeopardize anybody by coming to work if you're feeling under the weather. But generally, I would not be, with few exceptions, I generally wouldn't be shutting my business and all. So that's sort of first and foremost. The second thing is to think about, okay, what if my end markets dry up? What if my customers stop buying? What if, the problem with this is it all becomes self-fulfilling. If everybody else panics and stops buying and stops spending and stops traveling, et cetera, there are huge economic impacts. And that is sort of second derivative thinking or third derivative thinking about not what do you think is going to happen with the coronavirus, but what do you think other people are going to do in reaction to what may well be, a panic, an overblown fear. And how quickly might that pass, but how bad might things get? Look, as you showed earlier, Phil, in China, the entire country, the world's second largest economy, pretty well shut down. 90% of Starbucks in China were closed. Retail sales dropped 80%, et cetera. Now, the good news is, it wasn't in your slides, is as it's become clear that China's gotten a hold of this, things are easing up, and a friend of mine in Shanghai says things are 60 to 80% of the way back to normal. And so there will probably be a little bit of a new normal in terms of washing hands and so forth. But my sense is if I owned a business that had exposure to this kind of thing, I'd maybe be a little more conservative. I'd defer any big expenses that I didn't have to make that I was planning to make. Because I think actually it's not going to be, I don't think it's going to take 6 months for there to be clarity. I think there's going to be a lot more clarity within a matter of weeks, maybe a month or two.
What do you think the world looks like April 1? What would you bet?
3 weeks from now.
Yeah.
I think the number of new cases across the world it'll look like that China chart if you just pull up the last slide, Phil. Yeah. Right now in many, I'd say half dozen countries, including the United States, we are on the left side of that chart from a very low base. And the question is how quickly do we get that peak and have things start moving down the other side? Look, in this case, we are looking at a chart in China that only covers 3 weeks to the peak and a month since the peak, right? So we're not talking a long period of time. And look, I think once that peak is reached, I think everybody starts to relax a little bit. So my sense is, look, Harvard did not close indefinitely. They closed till the end of this month. Now, look, it happens. My daughter's school, a private school on the Upper East Side of New York, they're closing. Today is the last day of school. Now, here's the beauty of it, though. Friday was spring break anyway for 2 weeks. So all they did was just close 3 days early. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday are the only days of school that were canceled. And that does not strike me as an overreaction. It strikes me that's perfectly prudent to just start spring break 3 days early. And then in 2.5 weeks, I think there will be a lot more clarity. But I would bet a lot of money, like 80 to 90% likelihood that 2.5 weeks from now, my daughter's school on the Upper East Side of Manhattan with a young population, no risk factors there whatsoever, that they're going to open as usual 2.5 weeks from now on Monday, right after spring break. And my guess is that most of the universities that are closing down for this month will be back open, and I hope most don't close. I don't think it's necessary. I think for most universities, unless they have reason to believe that there's an infection hotspot somewhere on their campus, should just continue operating mostly as usual.
I think the thing I might disagree with you on about the universities, or at least add into the equation, is the staff and faculty obviously are
Yep.
older than the students.
Yep.
Let's see if there's more questions. So would anybody, raise your hand or type something into the Q&A? And there is one question here we didn't get to, but I'd love to hear from others and love to hear comments. If you disagree or you have a perspective, I'd love to bring you into the dialogue. So this anonymous attendee said, isn't the US closer to Italy than to South Korea or China? The US has not done widespread testing or quarantines. Why would the outbreak in the US be likely to be stopped without the aggressive countermeasures that really damage the economy?
Yeah. I don't know for sure. The US has, I'm just looking at the numbers in the US, and we're not seeing anything close to Italy right now. We're seeing numbers closer to France, Germany, Spain. And by the way, my wife and daughter were just in London last weekend. They had no hesitation. I had no hesitation they flew overnight on Thursday, spent Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and flew home. And you got to love the Brits. My wife and daughter said they observed absolutely no shutdowns, no nothing. They never would have known that there was a coronavirus in the world.
Germans bomb them every night for a year. They figured this is a little easier.
The old saying in the UK, you can buy all those T-shirts and mugs and all that say "keep calm and carry on." The British are sort of stoic. And they're just going about their life mostly as usual. Now, I'm sure people are washing their hands more, and elderly people and people who are at risk probably want to avoid big crowds for now and so forth. And that's generally my view of the world. And that could change fairly quickly as the data changes. But the U.S., the U.S., I think look, it's all probabilities. Could the rest of Europe and the US start to go the way of Italy? Yes. But look, I think during times of uncertainty and times of stress, the human mind naturally goes toward vivid things like the disaster in Italy, as opposed to what's happening in 160 other countries in the world, right? And the reality that in China, it's the number of new cases is virtually nil. So I can't say with certainty. And look, everyone should do whatever makes them comfortable. But I would simply point out that there are costs to overreacting. The best argument I've heard is, look, until there's more clarity, better safe than sorry. So let's cancel my trip, whatever. But there are very so what in effect though, because of the possibility of a very bad outcome, to avoid that, you are imposing the certainty of all sorts of other costs. And I just got an email yesterday from a friend who says his son is heartbroken. He's a high school senior, and they just canceled the senior prom. And you might say, well, that's the price you pay because people could die. But this is a kid now. There will never be another senior prom. That's gone forever. So there are those kind of costs as well.
All right, there's a couple good questions here. So, Leanne, you brought up a really important question about working from home, and that you've seen a bunch of people being forced to do that when they don't have a home easy to work from. They live in an urban area, small spaces. We're actually doing a flash talk on Friday. We're going to spend an hour talking about that and what are best practices. But I would like to say that if anyone on the call has learned something about these quick work from home practices, anything you can do to help people who don't have a great home setup, shoot me a note, and hopefully we can continue that dialogue, and I can connect Leanne, you, and Whitney. Our team works from home. We're all remote. I think your team does.
My team as well.
Yeah.
And it's easy though for us and for people in positions of power, the people who make decisions, the people who literally shut down towns, cities, countries. It's easy for them because they've got money in the bank and they have access to healthcare, et cetera. But think about what happens, if people sort of overreact and shut things down, and businesses go under and or people can't get to work, they lose their jobs. The statistics are pretty alarming. When someone is unemployed, when they lose their income, health outcomes crash. So there's an interesting, there's an interesting balance here about, okay, if you impose very draconian restrictions, you might save some people getting coronavirus and X number of deaths, but how many people lose their jobs, file for bankruptcy, and then end up dying as a result of that? It is literally, people literally die. The mortality rates when people lose their jobs go through the roof.
Yeah. All right. So let me just say, first of all, James Patterson just put up a link for working remotely, 7 tips to maximize productivity. Leanne, it's in the chat window, and others. And again, on Friday, we're going to have Brent Tereski, who is the CPO, Chief Product Officer at Envision, which has 900 employees and has been remote and is completely remote, sharing best practices and worst practices, what to do, what not to do.
Right. Let me just give you another quick story, quick anecdote. A friend of mine emailed me from Italy and said, okay, so Italy, they've imposed a nationwide quarantine. My friend's like, this is just politicians who underreacted, are now, to save their political skins, are overreacting. So guess what happened? Well, of course, Italians figured out that their government might do this. So what did they do the day before they locked down the whole country? Anyone who wanted to get home to their family or whatever, panicked and piled into the train stations in order to get home in advance of the worldwide ban. Well, gee, talk about creating a hotbed for the spread of coronavirus, right?
Yeah.
So again, there is I'm not saying there's a fine balance. Everyone personally needs to strike, in their business they need to strike, and that our government leaders need to strike, between foolish underreaction, but equally costly and foolish overreaction.
One of the things, and members of the councils know this. I mean, obviously this is an important moment. This is a difficult moment for all of us, and the degree to which we, get support for our own fears and panics makes a real difference. Like, it makes a difference in the lives of your family, in the lives of your colleagues at work. And one small thing that I urge everyone to do is, I this is a losing battle because I've done the research over decades. When people read news on mobile phones or on the internet, on a desktop or laptop, they scan the headlines and they don't actually read the articles. The articles are always more moderate and less inflammatory than the headlines. Like, there was a headline yesterday in Omaha, like 500 people, exposed to coronavirus. And you read it, it's actually, well, there was one woman at an outdoor stadium or something like that. And that's a really different thing than like 500 people just got sick, which is sort of what the headline implied.
And by the way, the media, fear equals engagement. So the media across the board this is the story, and so the media has very strong incentives. And look, there are a million experts out there. Journalists are naturally going to gravitate to the experts. I mean, there's one Harvard epidemiologist who says between 40 and 70% of humanity is going to get the coronavirus, and then everyone is emailing me saying, "Whitney, you're so wrong. Conservatively, let's say 20% of Americans get it." And then let's say the mortality rate is only 1%, not the WHO's 3.4% number. So that's, 600,000 Americans are dead. And I'm like, this is insane.
I actually know that guy. I've been following him closely, and he's consistently been at the extreme throughout the entire process, right? So, but if he's quoted in an article, of course
he gets the most publicity. Right. The epidemiologist who says, this too shall pass. It's a relatively minor variation of the seasonal flu. And so far it is not even 1% in terms of number of people infected or deaths of the seasonal flu. That guy doesn't get any publicity at all.
2 more questions. So Suzanne Constance brings up a good point, which is, are the Chinese stats self-reported by the Chinese government? So maybe it's all baloney.
Look, the Chinese initially.
Before you answer that, let me just give you the other question. So you have Bill Skeet asked a question of the various unknowns, like the rate of spread, the mortality, the lack of testing. What's the biggest risk, or the one you think deserves the greatest caveat? So two
Yeah,
questions
look,
about
the
numbers.
biggest
Yeah.
risk is that Italy is in fact what we all have to look forward to or dread. Um, and that we're looking at both mortality rates, of 6+%, and entire countries being locked down, and the economic impact and so forth. I think odds of that are pretty low. But look, I've lived through a lot of market panics, and I've lived through healthcare panics. And humanity, to its credit, we got a lot of scientists and a lot of smart people working on this, and humanity tends to sort this out. And I remember how much the travel stocks were selling off and people freaking out about Ebola, which is super contagious and super deadly, right? But we were able to contain it. It had devastating impacts in 2 or 3 countries, but did not spread. Now the coronavirus, a lot less deadly, seems to be more rapidly spread. Keep in mind though, the numbers we're looking at now, there's a lag time effect here, right? So the fact that everybody's panicking now isn't changing the numbers, the new case numbers, when people weren't panicking. I mean, it was only 3 weeks ago tomorrow that the S&P 500 hit an all-time high, to give you an idea of the level of complacency that existed a mere 3 weeks ago, right? So look, it's my sort of job as an investor and as an investment advisor is to be able to deal with uncertainty and to make probabilistic bets, but there's no certainty.
And so, and I think this is good. Kristen keeps asking sort of versions of this. Kristen, I think you're right. Like, why do you think the odds of repeating Italy are low? What information leads you to believe that? Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, look, I guess because they're first and foremost, look at China. China is where 80% of the cases reported in the world to date, 80% are in China, 72% of the deaths are in China. And China is almost like a worst case scenario, incredibly high population density, a relatively inferior system with an open air animal market. That was where apparently the virus occurred. Plus, you then had no one knew what was happening for at least the first month last fall. Then the government actively tried to cover it up and hide the reality for another month or two. And then I look at China, and China's gotten a handle on this. The numbers have crashed, right? So it's sort of ironic. Every single day that everyone is freaking out, the past week or so, China is reporting fewer and fewer new cases. And I do believe their numbers now. Obviously, their numbers were phony back then when they were trying to hide it. So that's the biggest data point that accounts for virtually the vast majority of coronavirus cases in the world. So then you're like, okay, so now let's look at Europe. And you've got the major countries of Europe, 5 or 6 countries, right? And 5 of them, things are okay, right? The cases are going up, but there aren't large numbers of deaths or whatever. And one of them is a very vivid outlier, right? So the question is okay, when I'm assessing probabilistically, what are the outcomes here? Do I think the most likely outcome, or even 30-40% likely outcome, is going to be the single outlier? No, that is not how I think probabilistically.
Okay, great. There's a few more great comments, by the way, in the chat window. I hope everyone's taking a look at this. So, and Charlie, if you can share these out to all attendees, because I think it's only panelists are seeing them now. But Leanne, I know you're interested in what others are doing vis-a-vis work at home. We're going to deal with that more on Friday.
Yeah, by the way, Phil, I do see a chat comment where someone's pointing out, yes, but China took drastic measures, right? That it won't be tolerated. And I agree. So, okay, let's look at France. Let's look at Spain. Let's look at Germany. I'm not sure. Let's look at Switzerland, the Netherlands, the UK. You can count the number of fatalities in these very large countries that are peer countries to Italy. You can count the fatalities, in some cases on 1 or 2 hands. The UK has had 6 deaths. The Netherlands has had 4. Switzerland has had 3. Germany has had 2. Spain and France have had 33 and 35, right? So Italy is the wild outlier. Again.
All right, we just have a few more minutes, and I
Yeah.
just want to share these 2 things, Whitney. So Doug Claffey shared that, and Doug, hopefully you're okay with me sharing this, that last night you and your wife were a little spiraling down from the pandemic and market news. So you went to goodnewsnetwork.org and read a few articles, and it really lightened your mood, which is great. I love that. I think, again, you know, our moods are contagious, right? And it makes a difference in our families and with our employees. Not to be unrealistic, but to be, you know, focused and connected. Tommy Doyle also noted on a positive note that the way the virus is being understood and cracked is very different than before. Open science, tools and techniques, the speed of the, you know, genome analysis and the vaccine. Now, it's going to take probably 12 to 18 months before there's a vaccine on the market, but that's still a radical improvement, and that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah. I mean, look, if we're lucky, the warm weather, look, all of the good news about people overreacting is that will actually hopefully become somewhat self-fulfilling, right? And that will reduce the spread of it. And then the warm weather kicks in the northern hemisphere. Hopefully countries in the southern hemisphere that then it's their flu season will then be very much on top of it. And then by the time the flu season rolls around later this year, again, back in the northern hemisphere, again, we're on top of it. Maybe we get lucky and a vaccine gets developed more quickly, et cetera. Though the best estimates I've seen are, you know, a year to 18 months. But again, it's, you know, it's important.
One more just focus question for you, Whitney, like, and I appreciate Kristen keep pushing on this. This is helpful. So China took extreme measures to prevent the spread, and that's likely the drop off. How do you think the U.S. will handle it? And what's so first of all, the U.S. has the example of China, and we didn't wait a month to do nothing and then another month to repress information. So that gives us an advantage. But what's your perspective on how the U.S. will handle this?
Yeah, I mean, look, the dangers of an overreaction that really tip us into a recession and lead to a spike in the unemployment rate and so forth, I think are going up every day as I observe things that I view as overreactions. Nobody can visit someone in a nursing home. Vanderbilt, Harvard, if multiple universities are all shutting down, the New York State, you guys may have just heard, basically put New Rochelle, not far from New York, under a state of quarantine or bringing in the National Guard. I suspect, unless things really start to spike up, I suspect it will be quite localized. You know, the nursing home in Kirkland, a particular community like New Rochelle. Americans, I think, tend to be more like the Brits in terms of stoicness and resilience. But I've been surprised so far. I think we've moved, we're starting to move into the overreaction category in my personal view. A couple of weeks of overreaction, probably, the good news is that going into this crisis, the economy was pretty strong. People are saying this could be the pin that pricks the debt bubble. I've heard that theory in the investing world, but I don't think there was a debt bubble. Interest rates were too low, but there was nothing like the fraud, the widespread fraud and off-balance sheet trillions of dollars and so forth back in 08. There's just no comparison. So we entered this from a real position of reasonable economic strength. I mean, not discounting income inequality, $1 trillion deficits. I do think one of the things of concern is here, I think slashing interest rates doesn't do very much, because that is usually effective when people are short on money, when money gets tight. But money's not tight. Consumers just aren't spending. They're canceling trips, et cetera. And so what you need there is fiscal stimulus. And the problem is during a time of economic strength and ultra 50-year low unemployment rates, you'd think the US government would be running a budget surplus. And instead, we're running $1 trillion deficit, which really ties our hands in terms of fiscal stimulus. That said, the US government can borrow money now at close to 0%. And so, you know, hopefully there will be both at the state, city, state, and national level. There might be some fiscal stimulus to offset the contraction in the economy that's occurring right now.
Yeah. Well, listen, we're 1 minute over, Whitney. I just want to thank you. Ask everyone to give you a round of applause. Can you hear the can you hear the clapping of all the folks? I appreciate you taking some time out of your ski trip in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. By the way, you are traveling.
Yeah. I mean, I will tell you that you know, my daughter, for example, was in New York on spring break, and I'm out here in Jackson Hole with a long planned family ski trip, and it never even crossed any of our minds to cancel her trip out here. I just think, you know, for most people, unless you have particular risk factors, you know, you just need to put this in context and look, unless the facts on the ground change, I think the good advice for most people who don't have risk factors in terms of where they live or their age or their illness or whatever, you know, can pretty much go about their lives as usual. That's certainly what my family and I are doing. But I reserve the right to change my mind and get more conservative if this thing, if the worst case scenarios that I cannot rule out start to materialize here.
So maybe we'll do another call on April 1 and see where things stand. Hopefully,
right.
we'll be on the right
I'm predicting that stocks will be higher,
yeah,
and that universities will be back in pretty much every university will be back in session.
Will start to be traveling again. Yeah.
But it's now you're recording this, Phil, so there'll be some accountability here.
I'll hold you to it. Okay, and if anyone wants to continue the discussion, you can send me a note, and I'm sure, you know, I can connect you to Whitney. I'm sure he's happy to respond.
And I'll be putting my latest thoughts out, you know, almost daily on my free daily email.
And I'll send a link to that.
EmpireFinancialResearch.com, and you can sign up for it.
I'll send a link to that, Whitney.
And please send around, Phil. I'm going to send you. I just fixed like one typo, so I'm going to send you the 12-page PDF that I published yesterday for my subscribers. I'll send you the latest version right now.
And we can just send that out to everybody who's on the call today, or all of our members. Great, I appreciate it. And everyone, let me know if there's anything you need at this point. Remember, our mission is you never have to walk alone, including during a crisis like this. So thank you. And thank you again, Whitney.
All right, my pleasure. Take care. Bye-bye, everybody.
Okay. Bye-bye.